Welcome to Passionate Reply, and welcome to Great Albums. This time around, we're looking at a fairly famous artist, and at one of his not as famous works, Gary Numan's Berserker, first released in 1984. For the most part, if you're a fan of Numan, you're either a fan of his earliest work and/or his recent work since the 1990s, and there's a substantive slump in between these two. In 1979, the artist made a tremendous splash with his initial hits Cars and Our Friends Electric, but after the release of his second solo LP, Telecan, only the following year, the public rapidly began to sour on Numan's android antics. While his early work is held in high regard and perhaps even unassailable for synth fans, most of his other work in the 1980s is met with a lot more scrutiny. Numan's bad days arguably came to a head with 1983's Warriors. Warriors was initially meant to have been produced by the great Bill Nelson, whose work Numan evidently much admired. However, the artists' clashing personalities allegedly made it impossible for them to work together, and Nelson left the project and had his name removed from it. Besides this period's poor aesthetic decisions, showcasing Numan with blonde hair and head-to-toe leather like a very sorry Billy Idol clone, Warriors feels like a mess of disjointed sonic ideas, losing the nucleus of what had made Numan special. Like most of Numan's work from this period, Warriors was not only a flop in the eyes of critics, but also an arguable commercial failure. It would go on to be the final record he released on the Beggar's Banquet label. After his release, he decided to take matters into his own hands and start an independent label, Numa Records. This is where Berserker comes in, having been the first independent release that Numan got to make. And I think it shows, in that the album comes across as extremely focused in its themes, as well as very willing to do things that are more novel and unique. The album's title track was its lead single as well as its opener. As it opens the album with the line, "I've been waiting for you," I can't help but feel that I too have been waiting for Gary Numan, whose true genius lay dormant for some years like the fabled king under the mountain. The title track's screeching guitar is, perhaps ironically, more reminiscent of Bill Nelson's famous guitar work than anything else on Warriors. Overall, I can't help but feel it resembles the general template of Numan's celebrated later work, with its emphasis on jagged electronic textures rather than traditional instruments, as well as its lyricism, portraying an abstractly menacing narrator who seems as inscrutable and inhuman as they do dangerous. In that sense, it's a bit of a glimpse into Numan's future. Still, one can't deny that Berserker remains an album that feels of its time, take it or leave it, as on the second and final single, My Dying Machine. My Dying Machine seems to revolve around its woodsy, sample-based percussion track, perhaps reminiscent of Geino Yamashita Gumi's work with gamelans and jigogs for the soundtrack of the famous film Akira later in the 1980s, albeit less organic and more precisely mechanical. It's a sound that I can't get enough of personally, but it's also something that springs directly from the advancements in sampling technology that were becoming more accessible by this time. The use of female backing vocalists, heard on many tracks throughout the album, is another touch that grounds Berserker in a mid-1980s context, as it was a fairly common trend at the time. But I'd argue that the employment of this technique enriches the album. Numan's backing choirs seem no less haunting than he does, surrounding him like sirens on a desolate crag, harrying us with hooks that in the past might have been played on an early synthesizer instead. The contrast of these female voices also helps highlight the greater vocal range that Numan himself attempts on this album. Squawking at higher pitches had been serviceable earlier in his career when he remained more indebted to punk, but on Berserker we really get a lot of his chest voice, and he proves himself to be a surprisingly competent vocalist on tracks like Cold Warning. Earlier, I argued that Berserker's title track prefigured Numan's later albums, but I was mainly comparing lead singles to lead singles. Cold Warning, I think, sounds a lot like the typical album track on a recent Numan album. Slower paced, somewhat atmospheric, and ominous in a more moody and subtle manner as opposed to directly threatening. Note also its intro, with its prominent use of a viola, which really stands out against Berserker's overall more electronic soundscape. By this point, Numan had been no stranger to incorporating traditional instruments. Earlier in his career, he'd been impressed by the work of Billy Currie of Ultravox, who played not only synthesizers, but also string instruments like viola, in the context of a rock group. Numan had gone as far as to hire Currie to perform on his 1979 LP, The Pleasure Principle, and its accompanying tour. Still, I think Cold Warning reminds me less of The Pleasure Principle and more of Numan's more recent efforts, particularly his 2021 album Intruder, which features Gorkem Sen playing the Yai Bahar, a novel string instrument of the latter's own invention. Still, for as much as Berserker stands out as one of the least commercial endeavors from this period of Numan's career, it's not totally devoid of pop influences. Take, for example, the track This Is New Love. Its title alone, This Is New Love, seems to announce itself as something more conventional and accessible, and indeed its lyrics are more straightforward than what you'll find elsewhere on Berserker. Those omnipresent backing vocalists are given a pleasingly hooky assignment here, and the instrumental arrangement, dominated by that oh-so-80s slap bass, is also less abrasive and an apparent nod towards pop. If this track were also a scrying crystal, I'd say it looks ahead to Numan's near future, and lighter, more funky tracks like Your Fascination. Of course, I can't do Berserker justice without talking about the visual side of this period in Numan's career. Front and center on the cover of the album, as well as contemporary supplemental releases like singles, we see Numan in the distinctive makeup associated with this era. Solid white skin with striking, solid, deep blue hair, eyes, and lips. On one hand, his appearance here shares a lot in common with where he got started, generally painted white with a lot of dark eyeliner, but there's also an element of newness about it in the use of that brilliant blue. Visually, as well as musically, Berserker feels to me like the ideal thing for an artist to be doing by the time of his 8th major release, whittling down to the very best elements that define their initial work, while incorporating and experimenting with new ideas at the same time. The last time we saw a headshot of Numan on the cover of an album was the aforementioned Telekin, but in contrast to the ambiguous and perhaps diffident expression Numan had there, on the cover of Berserker he seems much more sure of himself. Staring directly forward with perhaps a hint of anger suggested in his brows, he seems to regard us with confidence and a certain single-mindedness. Taken together, Berserker is an album that convinces, expressing a clarity, certainty, and cohesiveness of creative ideas. Like the savage and frenzied warriors of the Old Norse skalds, Berserker comes after us relentlessly, invoking something otherworldly as it does so. But as much as Berserker seems like such a determined statement, Numan never necessarily made an album that was exactly like it. He seems to have a relative soft spot for it in that he still performs tracks from this album in live sets despite largely snubbing the rest of his 80s output, but Berserker didn't exactly revolutionize the way he approached music at the time. For Numan, the 1980s were largely a time of throwing things at the wall to see what stuck, and as mentioned above, we know he wouldn't find what stuck for him until a decade after the release of Berserker. If you're looking for more of this sound, your best bet might be the 1985 single Change Your Mind, a collaboration between Numan and Bill Sharp of the jazz-funk outfit Shack Attack. While combining Numan's sound with funk may sound a bit strange, it's something that many of the synth whizzes from earlier in the decade had started doing to remain relevant in the mid to late 1980s. And at least on this cracking single, it seems to come together pretty well.
Why don't you ever listen? It's you I'm talking to. This time it's your decision. We're into something new. I know that I'm thinking the way you walk and say. Time that I was thinking of no one else but me. Oh, changing mind, nothing ever stays the same. Changing mind, no one ever plays a game. Changing mind, give up what you can't defend. Oh, change your mind, think you'll start again.
My favorite track on Berserker is The Hunter. While I've emphasized the extent to which Berserker is a forward-looking album for Numan in a sea of mostly forgotten mistakes, The Hunter is the track that feels the most to me like it could be a classic Numan work, and I could easily imagine a lower-tech version of it appearing on Telecon. Just listen to that delightful air raid siren synth rendition of the main vocal hook and I'm sure you'll agree. That's everything for today. Thanks for listening.
Something's wrong.